separate, Kevin.
Okay. This is for first namer, for all the Chorim of Klal Israel, and for protection for all the Israeli armed forces. They have Hashem's protection in their battles and also kept safe. Okay. So the next chapter is about leisure activities. So we'll just do a couple. Leisure activities on Shabbos. One should limit one's leisure activities on Shabbos to achieve an atmosphere which is conducive to the spiritual ideal of a day of delight. There are occasions when a leisure activity is by its nature requiring such a degree of concentration or attention that one may easily forget that Shabbos, as a precaution against performing malacha, it was ruled that certain leisure activities may not be performed, such as playing musical instruments, horse riding, swimming, or tree climbing. And bungee jumping could also be included as part of that. To fully appreciate the ease with which we forget ourselves, one only has to watch a guitarist sound a flat note. Absorbed in the music, the guitarist is likely to retune the string almost subconsciously. This would constitute a malach. And lastly, one is permitted to read books or journals, for example, those of a scientific nature, which may enhance one's general knowledge, but one may not read newspapers that relate to business or professional activities. Okay, let's leave it at that because it's an introduction and there's a few, we'll take another few sessions to finish this chapter. And also, one other thing is, like if you're playing a contact sport on Shabbos, some people recommend not doing so because if you're like running around a soccer field or playing touch rugby, you may create a divot in the grass or tear grass out of the ground. And that's all, which is basically like harvesting. So that's why some people recommend not playing a contact sport with other people. You kick around yourself, it's okay, but one should be careful not to tear or pull things out of the ground, or your action, running or kicking may cause cutting or cutting actions.
It's as follows. Whether you've got one animal mentioned or two, there's no ways that you could automatically include birds if you've got two. Because what it's proposing is, let's call it that, in other words, if you're mentioning one animal, Gav, if you're mentioning one animal, it's saying it has to be specific to all those characteristics. And if you mention more than one, it has to be specific to some of those characteristics. In other words, the characteristics that they, I don't know if they seem to have in common. I'm assuming so, but I would say not only to what they have in common, but what they differ. Because if two things are the same, then why bring it unless you want to hone in on the specificity? But if they're dissimilar, that might also be included in the category. It's not stating whether or not you just go to what they have in common, also what's unique about them. I would suggest probably what they have in common. Otherwise, because the more examples you have of something in common, the more somebody can derive a principle. Unless you use the term, this is what I don't understand in the Gemara, the animals that fall within these categories and are fairly clear. So you know whether or not it's inclusive or exclusive. That's my problem, Gavin, is that it like works around it and doesn't explain. Is it taking the characteristics of each animal, or is it the characteristics of what they have in common? But even if you want to say, according to the Gemara, that if you have more than one animal, it's some of the characteristics, not all, then it says what characteristics do they have in common? Well, not that they're kosher and treif, but that they're living, and therefore it includes birds. But you can't include birds on that because just hang on, Kevin, 1 second. It's including birds because they're both living creatures. That's what they have in common. What they don't have in common is the one's kosher and the one's treif. Okay? But the reason I'm saying that living creatures is too broad is that you can't include birds on that basis, because another thing they have in common is that they both are liable for their carcass carrying tumah if you touch it or if you carry it. And therefore, that's also what they have in common, which would exclude birds. So that's not enough of an explanation. It could be a reason to include or exclude birds. That's what I'm saying. What did you want to ask?
And then it goes into, on Shabbos Day Muktzah, you can't handle a dead carcass, a donkey or an ox, but you can handle birds for some reason. So if you're going, they're taking this to the nth degree. You're looking at every single option. It's but
the only two things I want you to bear in mind for this sort of purpose is if you see what they have in common and you broaden it to living creatures, you're including birds. If you say what do they have in common and you're trying to be specific, they both carry tumah, which would exclude birds. That doesn't add clarity to anything. That's all I'm saying. Because it's not telling you how broad, how expansive, or how constrictive to make the statement. Let's go on. We need to cover some ground.
Depends on the criteria. That's it.
The explanation is rejected. Which of these items, an ox or donkey, would you have the merciful one right? If Hashem wanted to include only one living creature whose carcass conveys tumah through contact and through being carried. So what it's basically saying there is the explanation basically assumes that the Torah could have taught this limitation by listing only one item in the specification, and that the additional item serves to expand the application of the law. So the Gemara argues that if the Torah had only listed one of the items, either an ox or a donkey, we wouldn't have assumed that the law includes any living creature whose carcass conveys tumah through contact and carrying. Rather, we would have understood the specification as teaching some other limitation of law. Okay? Precisely because the Torah lists both an ox or donkey, we ought to interpret the specification generalization, as including the laws those creatures whose carcass conveyed tumah through contact and carrying. So what does this actually mean? If Hashem had only written an ox, I would have said that an animal can be offered on an altar like an ox, is included for compensation. Okay? So in other words, what else apart from an ox is included that can be put on the altar? You've got sheep and goats, and in fact, that's sorry.
Only kosher animals. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All the kosher animals.
Yeah, correct. But the reason why it excludes chickens in this case is it's saying, what if it listed one, an ox? You could derive that the carcass conveys tumah if you touch it or carry it, okay? And it's animals that could be consecrated on an altar, okay? Which would eliminate, hang on, let me finish, which would eliminate birds, because birds don't contract tumah through their carcass. So even though they can go on the altar, they can't contract tumah through their carcass. So if you just mentioned ox, it would have excluded birds anyway on that basis, because it wouldn't have fulfilled both the criteria. It would have fulfilled the fact that it was, and by the way, birds is too broad, because an ox you've got an ox, you've got cattle, so you've got an ox and a calf and a cow, okay? The male, the virgin, the female, the baby, but it's a kosher animal. Birds, some can be kosher and some can be not. So even if you want to say kosher birds, you'd say, okay, but they don't convey tumah with their carcass. So it clearly wouldn't include birds. Now, you've got a problem, because if you only mentioned that, you would come to the conclusion only animals that can be offered on the altar is included into compensation for repayment if that animal died in your pit. But an animal that cannot be offered on the altar is not included. So to do away with this supposition, the merciful one wrote a donkey. And a donkey is never offered on an altar. Why, Kevin?
It's a kosher animal.
Correct. But if the merciful one had written a donkey only, I would have said that an animal that's subject to the consecration of the firstborn, yes, it's included. Yeah. Okay? But an animal that is not subject to the consecration of its firstborn is not included. So what are we saying here? Is exactly as Kevin said, the donkey is unique among non-kosher animals. So its firstborn is sanctified at birth, But you must either redeem it for a lamb, which is given to the Kohen. Why do you have to redeem it for a lamb, Kevin?
Yes, you can only offer a kosher animal. It's not kosher.
Well, yeah, the Kohen can only consume a kosher animal, and on the altar you can only offer a kosher animal. So I think its value is redeemed. That's correct. Or the animal has to be decapitated, but the Kohen can't partake of it. That's in Shemot chapter 13, verse 13. So the only other species whose firstborn are sanctified are what? Cattle, sheep, and goats. So those are firstborn of kosher species. Okay? So the firstborn of other species, camels, horses, they don't have any sanctity. So if the Torah had specified a donkey, maybe I would assume that the specification generalization includes only that which is similar to the specified item, meaning a donkey. It's subject to consecration of its firstborn, and it would have included cattle, sheep, and goats, but not any other species. So from that, I would have been hectically confused because it's not kosher. I still would have been stuck with thinking it had to be in the other examples of kosher animals. Kevin, give me 1 sec. So how do we derive that also non-kosher animals? Because I could have made an error and said two things. Either only treif animals are valid for compensation because I can't eat them. That's the error I could have come to. Or I could have come to the error that because a chamor, a donkey, the firstborn is entitled to be not consecrated.
Redeemed.
Redeemed is the right word. Then only those other kosher animals are included for compensation, not treif animals. Either way, if I just mentioned that, I could have come to an erroneous conclusion. In fact, they're contrary. They're contrary to each other. So because I'm saying on the one hand, you're saying a donkey is unkosher, so therefore you only get compensated if a non-kosher animal falls into somebody else's pit. Or alternatively, you could say only the fact that it was redeemed, which would leave the rest of the kosher animals, but why not mention a kosher animal? Then I'm terribly confused. Does it mean other kosher animals you don't get compensated for, or not any other treif animal? That's very confusing. So you needed both. Okay, let's just go on and cover a little bit of ground. So, yeah, Kev, no problem.
Donkey also is a very important animal, and when they talk about avoda for your animal, they refer to a donkey. So donkey has a lot of importance, even though it's a treif animal. As you say, exceptional.
A donkey, it's exceptional. The donkey spoke to them. It's mentioned in the Chumash, etc. It's true, but I'm saying it would have left me confused, Kev, because as far as a normal donkey that doesn't talk is concerned, I would have been a donkey because I couldn't have interpreted. Do I mean it's covered? Other treif animals are covered, or other redeemed animals are covered? They're contradictory. I wouldn't have known what to do with the statement. Okay, so that's the problem. So once, so basically, accordingly, the merciful one wrote an ox, which is superfluous. Why is it unnecessary to teach that? Because it's superfluous for the simple reason is that if I know for a donkey the firstborn can be redeemed, why would I need the ox to teach the same principle? Why would I need that mentioned? It would be either mentioned, as I said before, to include maybe a list of kosher animals since a donkey's treif. Because why would it mention the same? It would have to. So that's what I was saying before. Does it mean that things in common are taken into the rule book, or things that are both common and different are taken in the rule book? Or things that are only different? In other words, unique to each of them. That's actually the point. So the most precise common denominator is number one, that they're both living creatures. And the second common denominator is their carcasses transmit tumor through contact and carrying. But there's a question that remains, Kevin. How do we know that one must pay for a winged creature that's damaged in the pit? So the Gemara concedes, and it therefore provides another source for the inclusion of creatures, other than that explicitly mentioned being an ox and a donkey. Rather, all living creatures, including fowl, are included for compensation when damaged in a pit. What does it say in Shmot? It says the owner of the pit shall make compensation and the carcass shall be his. So that term, and the carcass shall be his, is not specifying whether that carcass contains tumah or not. It means any dead animal. In other words, it was living. So it implies that you must provide compensation for anything that's subject to death. It was living, breathing, and now it's not. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So then you're obviously including camels and horses for compensation when killed in a ball, since they're living creatures. And their carcasses also transmit tumah through contact and carrying. Okay? So we know now how the birds are included, because the carcass shall be his means that it includes any dead animal that was living, as far as that's concerned. Now, how do you get the more important question is, how do you know you have to pay for injury? Because this statement to me, if it's saying the carcass shall be his, maybe we're only talking about living creatures that die. But maybe we're not talking about compensation if they get injured. Well, that's the case, it's certainly as far as people are concerned. But as far as animals, we need to see and address it. How do you get covered for injury? We learned, obviously, in the Brisa, if a pit is 10 tefach versus 9 and under, etc., but where in the Chumash? So that's what we got to learn. Anyway, the Gemara analyzes the answer in light of the previously mentioned Tanaic dispute, right? So both according to the rabbis, who exclude utensils damaged in a ball from compensation, based on the exposition of the phrase of a donkey. And according to Rav Yehuda, he includes utensils for compensation based on his exposition of the term or, an ox or a donkey. So are utensils subject to death? That's what the Gemara is asking. It's saying, okay, so Rav Yehuda wants to say the word or also includes utensils. How are utensils subject to dying? How can they be included in the list? They don't seem to match the criteria. That's what the Gemara is proposing. Any answer to it, guys?
I agree with the Gemara.
Okay. Yeah, look, the Torah teaches that the owner of a pit has to provide compensation specifically for anything that is subject to death. So basically, Kevin, we're saying, why do the rabbis need a verse to exclude utensils? Okay? Or more importantly, how can Rav Yehuda expound a verse as including utensils? You know, firstly, why would the rabbis have a specific verse to exclude it? In other words, why should you have to say that in the Gemara it's referring to pluralities when you're using more than two? It can use a singular word referring to two, and you need the word or to show it's either or. It wouldn't have to go through that because, both the question isn't only on Rabbi Yehuda, it's also on the rabbis. Do you see that, Gavin?
Yeah. Well, it's completely right.
No, it's not. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the question is on the rabbis, because if I had to say, well, utensils are included because of the word or, coming to bring something else, and we're talking about only living things, then the rabbis don't have to even counter it with some sort of a logic about single and plural wording and why you need it, and the word isn't free. The rabbis wouldn't need to even defend their opinion. So the question is on the rabbis as well as Rabbi Yehuda. Do you see why, Gavin?
Yeah, no, thanks.
Yeah, because so the rabbis maintain the expression shall fall in can imply many animals, because it was shall fall in is a what do you call it? It's plurality, okay? And that you need the word or to separate an ox from a donkey, okay? So you don't have it to free for utensils. But if it's not free for utensils, you don't even have to come to that if you're only talking about living things. So the question is both on Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis. Otherwise, if it was just that clear, they wouldn't even answer the question from Rav Yehuda. So the Gemara answers, look, if it is so that the Torah meant to include only other living creatures, or living things that are similar to the specified living things, even in regard to Tumen transmission, then let the merciful one in his Torah write only one thing as the specification. Either you write the ox or the donkey. We would then have understood the generalization, specification, generalization as included only that which is similar to the specified item, both in being a living creature and having its carcass conveyed to through contact and carrying. By specifying an additional item, okay, so let me just explain it in a simple way. Well, you can say that there's a figurative term. Let's get started, guys. Just a quick summary for yesterday, okay? So we know Rav Yehuda and the rabbis, where do they disagree? Rabbi Yehuda says you are liable for utensils that are dropped into your pit when the animal fell down, if you're the owner of the pit, and the rabbis say there's no liability for utensils. That's where they disagree. Where do they agree? Well, they agree in the matter that when it mentions an ox or a donkey, that it's inclusive of other animals, okay? So the question is, let's say as follows. The expression and shall fall, okay? V'nafal, that's called a klal, which is a generalization. And when you say, listen, something that falls in, at that point you're generalizing. We haven't specified. So it's the verb. And that is a generalization, and it can refer to anything. Then afterwards, the verse goes, Shor v'chamor, the ox and the donkey. So in other words, it's general. It's talk about things that are falling into the pit. And then it's saying an ox or donkey, and that's a specification. Okay? Now, then it goes to a much more narrow definition. As we learned in Kedushin, where we were talking about a fact that it was called, it was referred to by Rav Yehuda Hanassi, okay? And basically, whenever there is a generalization and then it goes to a specification, the generalization contains nothing more than in the that's what's stated in the specification. Why? Because if you looked at the verse in Shemot chapter 21, verse 33, it literally says, and shall fall into it an ox or donkey. So what happens is it's one of the 13 hermeneutic principles of scriptural exposition. We said it's on page 49 of the Siddur. And what actually happens in the Art Scroll Siddur, what actually happens is that when you're talking about the general statement and it then assigns a specific application, the law only applies in that specific case. Okay? So Rashi discusses that the source of this is in Kedushin 21b, and he basically gives an insight into, how do you say it, the fundamental concept of the principle. So basically, it's known as the restrictive clause, and what's that? It's meant to be an explanation of the broader clause which precedes it. So the specific case defines a general statement, confining it to that application only. Right. So he's saying, okay, so since we know that principle, how on earth can you include other species of animals? Why? Because at that point we've gone from broad to specific. And if anything, we've gone from generalization to narrowing in on the animals mentioned in the Chumash. So it said you have to read the whole pasuk, because we start with the generalization, then we go to a specification, and then we go back to a generalization. So when you've got generalization, specification, generalization, or expansive, restrictive, and expansive, then what we're saying is when it expands, it doesn't expand to the degree before the restriction was in its place, In other words, does it go broad, basic, and completely? Or does it just go maybe slightly one step up? Okay? Because like upon occasion, the Torah will initially pronounce a law in general, in an expansive way, and then will follow the general statement with a restricted application of the law, and finally it would put forth another general statement to close the clause. So the hermeneutic principle called klal or prat over klal, generalization, specification, generalization. So that'll teach us how to expound the law. In other words, the final expansive statement serves to broaden the application of the law only by a certain degree, not to the degree that it was initially when it was too broad, to include all cases that are similar to the case described in the specific statement. But what we don't know is how broad we're going to make that. Okay, so the Gemara initially proposed yesterday, it said, therefore the derivation teaches, just as the specified items, an ox or donkey, are specifically living creatures, so too for any living creatures that are damaged by falling into the pit, the owner is liable. Okay? Now, that answers the question according to the rabbis. What would be interesting is how Rav Yehuda would answer it, because as we said yesterday, okay, so that's about living creatures to expand, but what about utensils? And then why have the hermeneutic principles when Rav Yehuda learns the word or, shova chamor, the or coming to include utensils, and what do you do with the hermeneutic principle? But anyway, at least it answers the rabbi's questions. And this covers every living creature. So then the Gemara is starting to question the assumption, and it's saying, look, alternatively, we maybe don't go as broad as that. Maybe what we do is we go a little bit more narrow, because to something whose carcass conveys tumah through contact and carrying. So it's saying the specificity said, look, there's certain things in common between an ox or a donkey. If it's a mammal, what would happen is that if the animal isn't shechted and it goes into a state of ne'ilah, its body itself carries some degree of tameh. Okay? And since that actually occurs, you can't touch it. You could even contract tumah if you put it into a container. So then any other animal who specifically dies, the what do you call it? The carcass itself becomes tumah, either through contact or carrying it. Okay. But what does that leave out? So if you're deriving that any other animal that conveys the tumah, then the only animals that could be put into it are generally mammals. But it took an example of a kosher animal and a treif animal, which is interesting because I personally never knew that a treif animal had any degree of tumah within the carcass. But I suppose if you look at a sheretz, that itself is a dead lizard, it would have tumah into it. So I suppose we're not even only talking about animals here, or mammals, Kevin. We're now talking about even lizards or reptiles. But for some reason, birds aren't included in the list. So birds, there's no tumah in the carcass, except, interestingly enough, if you ingest a kosher bird that hadn't been shechted, you've got tumah inside you. Yeah.
Serious.
Which is interesting because there is shechting involved. So therefore, the alternative compared to the elevated kedusha, when it drops a spiritual level, means it's a tumah. You know, because you'll have a woman that's pregnant and has the potential for life that loses it, and compared to that elevated status, she's unclean. Not that she's unclean compared to her previous statement, but compared to that elevated status. So too, when you can do a brocha and kosher chicken, when you're just ingesting it and it hasn't been shechted properly and there's no brocha and you're eating it killed in a treif way, so too you're ingesting tumah. But besides from that, if you're not ingesting it, there's no tumah for birds for carrying or contamination through touching it, etc. So what we're saying is maybe we are reducing, we're restricting the definition, not just to living creatures, but to those creatures which convey tumah with the carcass. So we don't know how broad or how constrictive the definition of the specification has to be. That's what we're playing around with now. So what we're saying is the Gemara answers well now, and that's the point we are at today, right? So it says, if so, the Torah meant to include only other living things that are similar to the specified living things, even in regard to tumah transmission. And it says, let the merciful one, who is Hashem, in his Torah write only one thing as the specification. In other words, either the ox or the donkey. And we would then have understood the generalization, specification, generalization, the klal, the prat, the klal, as including only those things which are similar to the specified item, both in being a living creature and in having its carcass convey tumah through contact and carrying. Okay, but by specifying an additional item, the merciful one indicates that the generalization, specification, generalization includes anything that is similar to the specified item, even in one respect. In other words, being a living creature. So what this is trying to propose, according to the explanation by Rashi, is since one specification would have sufficed to limit the application of the law to things that are similar to the specified item in all respects, the additional specification must have been written for the purpose of expanding its application to things that are similar to the specified item in some respect. Accordingly, we can include birds which are similar to even oxen and donkeys in as much as they're living creatures. Okay? So what it's saying is that maybe, it's proposing, the Gemara is just proposing, I'm going to open the floor to you guys now in terms of question. But what the Gemara is proposing is maybe the fact that it's mentioning both ox or donkey is coming to now make it less restrictive. Because if you only mention one of those animals, it becomes more restrictive. In other words, if you mention one animal, the proposal is it has to basically be exactly similar in all respects. But if you've got more than one item listed, it only has to be similar in some respects, which it would then include birds. So what's this big deal of birds? Well, we know that birds are included in the damage. Why that didn't flap and escape getting, I don't get that. You ask me why I get that. I mean, even a chicken can flap and break its fall. I don't get that. Do you know what I'm saying? Guys, most birds that you know can at least, they might not be able to fly high, but they won't fall on impact and break themselves that way. So that's something I'd like to speak to Rabbi Cohen about. But we know that birds are included. I don't know whether it's in a Mishnah or a Bryce or what, but it's obviously implicit by the fact that there's no exclusion, maybe. So, what is this last statement by Rashi coming to say? In other words, Kevin, why are we mentioning both the animals instead of one? Or Gavin, maybe you want to explain it to me. In other words, I'm asking you three questions. I'm asking you, what has just been proposed by the Gemara to include birds? How did they give a rationale that birds are included? And how do they connote having one animal mentioned instead of two in terms of covering some or specificity? Does anybody want to answer it? And number three, what's your opinion on it?
So what's happening here is that the reason why both animals, while the one makes it what's it called restrictive. So what's happening here is to make sure that you incorporate both kosher and non-kosher animals. Otherwise, you would have thought it was just kosher animals.
No, I understand your point, No, I understand your point. That's a separate point. I think it's a brilliant point, but it's a separate point. What Gavin, I think you're trying to say, just tell me if I'm wrong, is that by having more than one animal, it's inclusive of both kosher and non-kosher, which is what I proposed early on. But that's just from my head, because you're liable for both kosher and non. But the Gemara is not emphasizing that particular point. What point is it emphasizing that you would include birds for?
Living creatures, all living creatures.
Yeah, but I'm saying what according to, in other words, what I'm asking is as follows. Let me be very specific of my question. If we are saying that one animal is mentioned, what is the implication that the Gemara is trying to suggest compared to both animals being mentioned? That's what I'm asking specifically.
No, well, you'd think that if one animal is mentioned, it would be more restrictive than if two are mentioned. You think that by mentioning two, it's broadening it, but it's not. It's actually restricting it further, isn't it?
Okay, so Gavin, I like what you're saying. You're saying what I was thinking. Just hang on a second.
Kevin, that was from both of us.
No, it was on you. You, the man. You.
Okay. So, Gavin, I thought that was brilliant because it was a problem that I had when I was reading it until I read the follow-up statement. I thought of it like this. If you're coming to say that one item mentioned is more expansive because it has to contain all those criteria, whereas two animals means that it only has to be similar in some respect, it's opposite logic to what you and I were thinking.
And to either animal as opposed to just to the one. So now, instead of having to be close to just the one animal, so let's say one animal might be similar to an ox, but it's be completely dissimilar maybe to a donkey. So by incorporating let's say it's not similar to an ox, but it's similar to a donkey. So by incorporating a donkey, it allows, so each animal's got certain characteristic traits, right? So you've got more characteristic traits to match now, as opposed to having just a few from one animal. That's what I'm saying.
Yes, but what I'm saying is you and I are agreeing, but let me just word what the problem is with what we're learning so far. It's proposing what I thought was opposite to logic, and so were you. And by the way, it doesn't mean it's Rashi's opinion. It means Rashi is explaining it. I just want you to bear that in mind. So what it's suggesting is that one specification would have sufficed to limit the application of the law to things that are similar to the specified item in all respects. And by basically expanding it, by adding another animal, they only have to be similar in some respects, okay? And accordingly, we can include birds because they're similar to oxen and donkeys in as much as they're also living creatures, okay? But the problem with that logic for me, and I think you touched on it, but you might not have worded it exactly the same, but I'll give it to you, is that it's counterintuitive. Let me tell you why I'm saying it's counterintuitive. If I'm an alien and I get a list of certain people to take up in my spaceship, okay? And in my spaceship, I've got saying, pick up a man. Okay. I look at the anatomy, I say, all right, I'll pick up a male specimen to do medical experiments on. Now, I don't know what race, creed, height, health, country, etc. It's so general. So it can't be, so when it says it's similar in all respects, okay, that's fine. But the minute you add details, you get actually more honed in a certain way. Because if you say, listen, on my list are these 5 people, and they all seem to come from Southern Africa, then I know my region, it says, please expand from there, means that it's probably going to be within that territory where I pick up other specimens. So, which means the more we have of similarity, the more we're honing into other criteria that have to meet both those animals or both those criteria. Does that make sense? In other words, a man from South Africa and a woman from South Africa as you're expanding the list. Then you've got the issue of saying, well, listen, exactly as I was saying before, and Gavin, it was also concurring, you've got a donkey which is treif, and you've got an ox which is kosher. So maybe this is telling you it's something else. Maybe it's telling you that if you're obligated for both, whether it's kosher or treif, in that particular case, you have to pay if it falls in your pit. Now, I wouldn't know that by mentioning one creature. That's the problem. Because if I'm mentioning one creature, the one thing what the Gemara says is it has to then be similar in all respects. So that's what I think it's trying to mean. In other words, if I just mentioned an ox, I would not be able to deduce, there's not enough information if I could include non-kosher animals there. Because the only thing that's mentioned is a kosher animal. So there's not enough information. So I would, from a restrictive point of view, have to specify it to a kosher animal because I'm not sure what criteria. In other words, one is just too simply a small selection to be able to determine. It's still too general with one. Does that make sense? But then I would go on the safe side and said you're covered for a kosher animal. Now, the minute it mentions a donkey, you're also then covered for a treif animal. If it mentioned the one or the other, you couldn't have deduced the other. So when you mention one, it's saying it has to be similar in all respects. But the problem I have with that statement is all respects in regard to what? In regard to whether it's kosher, in regard to whether it's consecrated, in regard to whether you can eat it, whether you can put it on the mizbeach, whether in case it's a mammal or warm-blooded, whether it's a case to a tumah, etc. So I would think that by having more than one animal, it says it has to be similar in some respect. So why I get that statement, I'm trying to explain, is that if you've got more than one animal, it has to be similar in some respect. So what does that mean? Maybe it means all animals, because we learn we've got a kosher animal and a treif animal. But it doesn't mean in all respects either a kosher or treif animals you're covered for. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily including birds. Why? Because both an ox and a donkey convey tumah in their carcass by carrying it or touching it. So they're similar in that respect. So on what basis could you include birds? In other words, if you mentioned one or the other, you couldn't include birds. It's too broad. If you mention both, you definitely can't include birds because it's now you've got even more information at your hands. Does that make sense? So it's a problem. Sorry. Guys, what I'm saying is you could say it in a simple way, Kevin. Say I'm driving my car to your house in Sandringham, right? And I turn around and say, listen, my battery's died, the car. I'm waiting for the AA. Now, is a battery living? Is a car living? If the auto electronics die. So what do I mean? I'm talking figurative. The one is a literal death, and the other one is a figurative death. So the Gemara's answer is, with respect to utensils, their breakage is their death. So what do we mean? Is like a shattered utensil is figuratively dead, meaning it's no longer of use. Okay? So it doesn't necessarily exclude utensils. Doesn't include them either necessarily. But the rabbis maintain that a donkey is needed to exclude utensils because they can both figuratively die. I don't know how that then would exclude it. In other words, if you're including a donkey that could die, why would that exclude utensils that could figuratively die? That I don't get, to be honest. I don't understand that particular point, okay? But the point of it is Rav Yehuda makes sense in a way because he assumes that since utensils are not subject to death in the literal sense, they would have automatically been excluded. And the word or comes to include them even though they do not literally die. Okay, so Rav Yehuda in this case makes a little bit more sense in that he was saying, listen, you've got a literal death and therefore it's excluded. It's not the same as a figurative death. And therefore you need the word or to include it because you can't assume a figurative death is the same as a literal death. In this way, Rav Yehuda makes more sense, doesn't he? Okay, so what the Gemara asks further is, and according to Rav, let's make the question even stronger, who said that concerning the pit in the public domain for which the Torah made the digger liable, what did Rav say? Why is the digger liable for an animal that dies in a pit, or the owner of a pit? What kills the animal?
The foul air.
Excellent. And what does Shmuel say?
The foul air and the impact.
The foul air or impact. It doesn't have to be both. Okay. So excellent. Gavin's answered the question. So the reason why, Kevin, is that Shmuel, according to Shmuel, object falls in a pit, a utensil like a ceramic pot and breaks. Okay, you covered. There's impact damage. You covered. According to Rav, how does he say that you would even be affected? In other words, how would Rav Yehuda say, according to Rav? Because how does foul air make you culpable if you don't hold damage liability for impact? How would Rav Yehuda answer Rav's question? It's difficult because Rav would say there's no impact. So how does an object actually... It's a problem. You know what I mean? So if Rav Yehuda says, maybe I hold like Shmuel, but he'd have to explain Rav, because I think Rav and Shmuel go above Rav Yehuda as a Tana. I don't know exactly, but apparently that he'd have to have an explanation. How does Rav hold like that? His opinion would have to work with both Rav and Shmuel. So the reality is he has got an answer. He said, look, how does foul air affect an object? Well, according to shattering for Shmuel, we'd understand. As far as utensils are concerned, what does the foul air do? So the Gemara answers, they say, indeed, according to both the rabbis and Rav Yehuda, they say that utensils can be subject to damage through foul air. I'll give you two examples quickly. The foul air, if you don't, the Gemara uses an example in the notes, that if you don't kiln pottery properly, in other words, pottery, I used to make pottery at Nadine Stiller's mother, and basically afterwards it would be put in a kiln at like 1,000 degrees, I don't know what, and it would harden the clay so that it would be waterproof and weatherproof. So if the clay is soft, the foul air would damage the ceramic item. It could explode. It has a tendency to cave in or explode with the foul air if it's mixed with other chemicals, unless it's been killed. Okay, put in a kiln. Not killed, put in a kiln. Also, remember we learned that clothing is considered a utensil, because the word utensil isn't just a kitchen utensil where you're stirring. A utensil can be utility of use. So a dress for a woman is a utensil. It has the utility to cover her. So if it is obviously got soot and grime and everything else, if she's down in a coal mine, she's not going to exactly be able to use that wedding dress again. So that foul air would damage the wedding dress. It's not going to break on impact. It's not ceramic. But it's certainly going to be messed up as a utensil. So either it's a pottery that hasn't been put in a kiln, or it's a utensil like a wedding dress that could be damaged in foul air. So that's the answer. Okay? So the rabbis also have to answer, not only Rabbi Yehuda, because they go through the whole point of trying to reject that utensils are not included. And if there was no validity to it, they wouldn't even bother to answer the question. Okay. So basically, we're nearly done. The Gemara further questions the validity of the source for which teaches that the owner of the boar. I tell you what, guys, I think I'm happy to finish. I'm happy to finish at this point. What do you guys say?
I'm happy.
I just want to ask you a question before you sign off. Okay, yeah, we can. Gavin, up to you. Okay, just about the utensil. You're saying that opinion that says the utensils can be damaged by foul air. Then, but this is just a discussion. It's not the accepted last word or final opinion. It is a possibility.
If you hold according to Rav Yehuda, yes, but the reality is we don't know how the halacha holds. The Rambam in the Mishnah Brura or the commentary, because he's got something called the Mishnah Torah, which derives all the halachas from all the Gemaras, including Bava Kamma. So he might say we hold like the rabbis. But at the end of the day, before coming to the conclusion, we have to at least say how the rabbis and Rav Yehuda would answer damage by foul air, because they both address the issue.
Okay, so if utensils, they were attached to the body of the ox that fell in the pit. They didn't. So it was still someone's property, and if they were damaged, why shouldn't there be liability? You know what I mean? It seems a bit weird that. I know we learned up to now that utensils there's the exemption for damage to utensils, but it's still the property of someone that got damaged in the pit.
Kevin, I agree with your logic completely.
It's a bit weird. You know what I mean?
I totally agree with you. If you had to ask me on pure logic, without learning the Gemara, if somebody's property was damaged by somebody else's hazard, do you have to pay for it? I'd say absolutely.
And also that a person. There's the difference between death and injury for a person that falls in the pit. The death is depends on the intelligence, but there's also a distinction, which is also a bit weird.
I agree with you there also. I mean, if you're asking my personal opinion based purely on logic, I would say if you have to pay for injury that you caused, if somebody got injured in your hazard that you created in public property, and you have to pay for the injury, even more so for death of a person, not exemption. I'm just
that even if it's 5 steps in, if the guy managed to fall in head first and died, it doesn't matter how he died. I mean, the fact that he died in there, it should be, you know what I'm saying? That's why
I'm even saying even more than what Gavin's saying is that not only are you culpable, but in other words, if you're responsible for injury, even more so you're responsible for death, because somebody's injury could be temporary, whereas death, you've deprived them of a breadwinner maybe. Never mind exemption. In other words, why is a person that didn't look where they're going get paid out for injury in the pit, but not for death, when in fact it's the same person that didn't look where they were going?
Yeah.
If you want also that human beings, you saw that it's in the Gemara there somewhere, because I read on Saturday, is that animals are prone to walk with the head down and human beings with the head up.
Again, Gavin, the logic is as follows. To me, by logic, you either have to be consistent. You either have to say, look, if a human being is responsible for where he walks, then I'm not responsible for either injury nor death. If a human being is not responsible to look where he walks, then I'm responsible for injury and even more so death. How do you have a double rule book?
An animal walks with his head down is more likely to pick up but a human being walks with his head up. So it's not stupid. You know, so a human being can't really see that thing. So if he falls in there and he dies or he gets injured, or his utensils get injured or whatever he's carrying, he should get all of it.
You know, Gavin's made the question stronger. He's saying, he's even agreeing, he's saying not only could you exclude a human being, because you could say maybe a human being is more intelligent and should know. You could say that you're even more liable for a human being because he doesn't walk with his eyes, as we learned on a bicycle, if somebody puts something in the public domain, you're not looking down when you're looking at eye level. You don't walk on all fours. So therefore, you're even more liable for a human being. Never mind less liable for a death. I don't understand.
Yeah. All right.
Listen, Gavin, our job is just to learn this, and at 120, it'll all be explained to us.
100%.
Yeah.
Not explained, just finalized. because we would have some sort of idea just to get the final, the stuff that we don't understand 100%. Well, yes, you mean the stuff that we don't understand 100% now while we go through it will be explained to us.
Yeah, well, I think what happens is we're getting to see clarity in different points, but how the whole thing fits together and all these contradictory things that would be, I think that weaving tapestry would be explained in context.
Maybe when you finish the entire Bava Kamma, it will sort itself out. Let's see.
So other than that, what we do is as follows. We speak to Rabbi Cohen and we spend maybe 2 or 3 days on Bava Kamma after we finish it, please God. And we look at all the problems we've had and all the inconsistencies and see if Rabbi Cohen can address them. And give him a heads up first.
Hopefully,
you might have to do a bit of chazorah on something or just check up something. But I'd say for the most part, you can probably give us all the answers.
Yeah, but we can't say it says here and says there. We've got to say on Daf XX it says this. On Daf it says to the contrary. According to our logic, I would have thought that how much more so for that. You know what I mean? We've got to be a bit specific.